My name is Caroline Ashford. I am 41 years old, and on what was supposed to be the most beautiful Saturday morning of my life, the man I loved handed me a document across the breakfast table and said, "Sign it today, or we postpone the wedding." I remember the exact weight of the silence that followed. I remember the sound of the coffee maker finishing its cycle in the kitchen behind me, that soft mechanical sigh of a machine that did not know anything had just changed. I remember looking at him, at his jaw set, at his eyes steady and patient, in the way that certain men learn to be patient when they are asking for something they fully expect to receive, at his hands folded on top of the paper like he was presenting a business proposal and not dismantling everything I thought we were. And I remember thinking, very clearly, with a stillness that surprised even me in the moment I felt it, he has no idea what he just set in motion. The document was a deed transfer form. He had already filled in his name as co-owner of the property I had purchased 7 years before I ever met him. He had attached a sticky note in his own handwriting that said, "Just a formality. It's what married couples do." The wedding was 9 days away. 212 guests. A venue deposit of $18,000 that I had paid in full with a check drawn from my business account. A dress hanging in my mother's guest room in Worthington, Ohio, that had taken 4 fittings and 11 weeks to arrive. A rehearsal dinner reservation at Rigsby's Kitchen in German Village for that coming Friday evening. A honeymoon booked in Lisbon and the Douro Valley for the week after the ceremony. And he sat there with his coffee and his folded hands and waited for me to pick up the pen. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I folded the document in half along its center crease, set it on the table beside my breakfast plate, and said, "Let me think about it." He smiled. He genuinely, warmly, confidently smiled. That smile told me everything about what he believed the next 9 days would look like. And in that moment, I understood something with perfect and permanent clarity. Marcus Delaney had mistaken my patience for weakness for the last time. This is that story. Before we go any further, I want to stop and ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. Where in the world are you right now? What city? What country? What time does your clock say? Drop it in the comments below. I want to know whether you are watching this at midnight with headphones in because the house has finally gone quiet, or whether you are on your lunch break with the sound low, or whether you are halfway across the world in a time zone I have never been to. There is something that matters deeply to me about knowing that women across the entire globe are sitting with this story right now, and I want you to know I see you. And if stories like this one, stories about women who were underestimated and overlooked and who built their answers in silence rather than in arguments, if they reach something in you, please like this video right now and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. We release a new story every single day, and every one of them was built for women who know what it feels like to be the most capable person in the room and the last one anyone asks. Marcus Allen Delaney was 44 years old when he put that document on my table. He was the kind of handsome that registers in a room before the person attached to it has said a word, dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, tall enough to carry a well-cut suit the way suits are supposed to be carried, with a voice pitched in the lower registers that rooms instinctively quieted to hear. He had learned early that his appearance was currency and had invested accordingly. He wore watches that told time and status simultaneously. He drove a silver Audi that was always clean in the way that things are clean when someone else cleans them. He worked in commercial real estate brokerage in Columbus, Ohio, a field in which the primary instruments are charm, presentation, and the confident management of other people's money, and he was very skilled with all three. We met in October of 2019 at a charity gala held at the Whitmore Hotel in downtown Columbus. I was there with my colleague Dana Price, who ran operations at Ashford Strategic Group and who had suggested the event as a networking opportunity. Marcus was there as a sponsor, which meant his name was on the program, and he moved through the room with the ease of someone who had paid to belong there. He appeared at my elbow between the silent auction and the dinner service, and introduced himself without waiting for the introduction to be requested, which was either confidence or presumption, and at the time I read it as the former. He asked me to dance. I said yes because I was 47 days out of a long relationship that had ended quietly and badly, and I had not yet decided what to do with the part of me that had been reaching toward someone and now had nowhere to reach. He was there, he was warm, He was very good at making you feel like you were the only person in a room full of people. I should tell you who I was before I tell you who I was becoming, because Marcus met me at a particular juncture and I want to be precise about what I had built before he arrived. Ashford Strategic Group was a management consulting firm I had founded 11 years before our first conversation, when I was 29 years old, and recently passed over for a partnership at the firm, where I had given 5 years of my best work. The decision not to make me partner was explained to me by a man named Terrence Collier in a conference room with a view of the Scioto River, and his explanation took 9 minutes, and when he was finished, I thanked him for his time, went back to my office, drafted a resignation letter, and spent the weekend creating a business plan on a legal pad that would eventually become Ashford Strategic Group. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. By the time Marcus appeared at the gala, Ashford Strategic had 14 full-time employees and a client roster that included 3 regional hospital networks, a national logistics company, and several mid-size manufacturing firms across Ohio and Indiana. Our revenue for the fiscal year 2019 was $2.3 million. I had a business partner, a patient and meticulous woman named Ruth Chambers, who served as both my chief financial officer and my accountant, and who had been with me since year 3 and who I trusted with every number I had. I owned the commercial building on Granville Street, from which we operated, a brick property I had purchased in the spring of 2013 for $840,000, and which by the autumn of 2023 carried a conservative appraised value of $1.9 million. And I owned my home, a 4-bedroom house on Carrington Drive in Upper Arlington, which I had purchased 12 years earlier and renovated in stages as the business grew. That house was on the deed Marcus handed me at the breakfast table. That was the property he wanted half of. I want to be careful and honest about the early years with Marcus, because the story I am telling you is not a story about a woman who was naive. It is a story about a woman who paid attention, who gathered evidence, who moved carefully and with intention, and who still found herself at a table with a deed transfer form. Because hope is a powerful counterweight to evidence, and love has a tendency to negotiate with what it knows. The early years were genuinely good. Marcus was attentive in a way that felt considered rather than performed. He remembered small things. He made reservations at restaurants and told me why he had chosen them. He met my 2 closest friends, Lauren Beckwith, who had been my roommate at Ohio State and who was now a pediatric nurse practitioner in Dublin, and Patricia Osai, who ran a nonprofit in Clintonville, focused on housing stability, and who had a way of assessing people that she would not describe as cynical, but that I would describe as efficient. Marcus charmed them both at a dinner in the 2nd year of our relationship, though Patricia pulled me aside near the end of the evening and said, very quietly, without preamble, "He talks about money a lot." I laughed. I said, "He works in commercial real estate. That's the industry." Patricia nodded once and said nothing else. I filed it. The first clear signal came in the spring of 2021. I had just signed the largest single contract in Ashford Strategic's history, a 2-year engagement with a regional hospital network valued at $420,000. I came home that evening and told Marcus over dinner. He listened the way he always listened, with full eye contact and what appeared to be genuine interest. And then he set down his fork and said, "With money like that coming in regularly, we should probably think about combining some accounts." We had been dating for 18 months. We were not yet engaged. I looked at him across the table and said, pleasantly and without hesitation, "Let's revisit that when we're married." He laughed and moved the conversation elsewhere. But I had heard it, and I put a date and a note in the burgundy notebook I had begun keeping in my desk drawer at home. The second signal came 14 months later, in the summer of 2022, and it was less subtle. Marcus had an opportunity to invest in a commercial development project in Dublin, a suburban area north of Columbus, and he was short by $90,000 of the minimum buy-in threshold. He came to me on a Sunday afternoon and sat across from me in my living room, on the couch I had chosen and the rug I had selected, in the house I owned, and he explained the project in detail. He named the developers. He quoted the projected returns. He said, "You won't even feel it at your liquidity level. It would be 6 to 8 months, and you would see a 30% return." And then he said the sentence that I wrote down verbatim that evening. "You have the money sitting. It's not doing anything." I told him I would think about it. That week I asked Ruth Chambers to run a background review on the project's principles. She came back to me within 4 business days, with a summary that was 2 pages long, and documented 2 prior civil judgments in Ohio courts against 2 of the 3 principals for failure to perform on investor promises. The most recent judgment had been entered 18 months before Marcus's pitch. I told him I had decided not to participate. He went cold. Not angry, not confrontational, just cold in the specific way that people go cold when a resource they had mentally allocated is withdrawn. 4 days later, he was warm again. But I had added 3 pages to the notebook. The engagement happened in January of 2023 at Lindy's restaurant in German Village on a Tuesday evening, and I want to be truthful with you, it was beautiful. He had coordinated with the restaurant. At the table next to ours were Lauren and Patricia, and my colleague Dana, and 2 of Marcus's closest friends. And when Marcus went down on one knee and I said yes, the room around us broke into applause. That felt like something I had not known I needed until it was happening. I was 40 years old, and I was standing inside a moment that was entirely, genuinely happy. And some part of me believed in the way that people who have been patient for a long time believe things, that the signals I had observed and documented were the rough edges of a person who was growing into something better, and that love, properly given, could round those edges down. I was wrong, but I would not know exactly how wrong until the morning of the deed transfer, which arrived 9 days before 212 people were supposed to watch me marry him. I spent the remainder of that Saturday morning, after Marcus left for his office in his clean silver Audi, with his briefcase and his confidence intact, sitting alone at that breakfast table reading the deed transfer document with the careful attention I bring to a contract review. What I found was this. The document was not drafted by a real estate attorney. It had been printed from a legal template available online, poorly adapted, with Marcus's name inserted by hand in the field designated for co-owner. The co-ownership structure it proposed would give him a 50% interest in my home in perpetuity, with no provision for what happened to that interest in the event of separation or divorce. No buyout clause, no valuation mechanism, no sunset provision, no acknowledgement of the 12 years of mortgage payments, renovation investments, and property tax assessments I had made as its sole owner. Just 50%. To a man I had not yet married, attached to a sticky note referencing the legal opinion of a man who sold insurance. I turned the document over. Tucked into the back fold was a second handwritten note I had not initially seen, in Marcus's handwriting, that read, "Talk to my attorney contact. He says this is totally standard for married couples. No need for a formal prenup." His attorney contact was, as I would later determine, a college acquaintance who had briefly practiced real estate closings before switching to corporate HR compliance. He was not a family law attorney. He had never drafted a prenuptial agreement. That afternoon, I drove to the offices of Ramona Voss. I had been given Ramona's card by Ruth Chambers 2 years earlier, in a conversation that began with my asking Ruth, in a tone I tried to keep casual, whether there was a family law and property attorney in Columbus worth knowing if such a need ever arose. Ruth had looked at me for a moment, reached into a drawer, and placed a card on the desk between us without a word. I had taken it home and put it in the back of the second drawer of my home office desk, and tried not to think about what the act of keeping it implied about what I believed was coming. Ramona Voss was 53 years old, wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, had practiced family and property law in Columbus for 26 years, and had the specific manner of a person who had spent more than 2 decades sitting with people in the worst weeks of their lives and had developed from that experience not hardness, but a very efficient form of warmth. She read the deed transfer document in approximately 4 minutes while I sat across from her. She set it down, she took off her glasses. She said, "He wanted you to sign this 9 days before your wedding." It was not a question. I said yes. She said, "And you didn't sign it?" I said no. She said, "Good. How long have you been keeping notes?" That question opened 2.5 hours of conversation. We covered 3 distinct areas. The first was the immediate legal landscape of the deed transfer document and what it represented under Ohio property law. The second was the question of what legal protections I needed in place before any marriage ceremony took place, including a formal prenuptial agreement, a property trust, and a protective order that would prevent any deed transfer from being recorded without my explicit witnessed consent. The third was Ramona asking me, near the end, in a quiet and direct way, "Is this a man who made an embarrassing mistake about real estate, or is this a pattern of behavior you've been tracking?" I reached into my bag. I placed the burgundy notebook on her desk. She opened it and read without speaking for 4 minutes. Then she looked up and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." I told her everything from the beginning. All of it. The first account combining comment over dinner in 2021, the Dublin investment pitch in 2022, and the civil judgment history Ruth had uncovered. Every note in the burgundy notebook. And then I told her about the email. The email had come to Ruth's attention 3 weeks before the wedding through a mutual contact in the Columbus commercial real estate community, a woman named Sandra Holt, who had worked alongside Marcus at his brokerage and who had forwarded it to Ruth without comment, simply noting that Ruth might find it relevant. The email was a message from Marcus to one of his business partners, sent 4 months before our wedding date, in which he described the financial picture of the upcoming marriage. The language was specific. He described my home on Carrington Drive as, quote, "a property I'll have partial ownership of through the marriage." He described Ashford Strategic as a business I'll have marital claim to if we ever separate. He did not describe me by name. He described me as my fiancé's assets. Ruth had printed the email and placed it in a folder on my desk without annotation. I had sat with that folder for 3 days before I called Ramona. Over the 8 days between my first meeting with Ramona and the wedding ceremony, I did not cancel the event. I did not confront Marcus. I did not speak to my mother about what was happening, or to Lauren, or to Patricia. On the Sunday evening, 2 days after my first meeting with Ramona, Marcus sat across from me at dinner and brought up the deed transfer again. He was careful about it, almost gentle, the way you are gentle with someone you believe needs managing rather than hearing. He said, "I know the document surprised you. I probably should have talked about it earlier, instead of just putting it in front of you like that." I said, "Yes, you probably should have." He said, "Can we find time this week to sit down with a neutral third party and talk it through? I think if you heard it explained properly, you would see it is not a big deal." I said, "Let's plan for after the honeymoon." He looked relieved. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his and said, "I just want us to start our marriage in a good place." I said, "Me too." And I meant it. In the way you mean something that is true, at a level the other person cannot access yet. On the Tuesday evening, Marcus told me that his brother Derek had sent him a revised version of the deed document with slightly different language, and that his attorney contact had reviewed it and said it was even cleaner than the first. He said he would leave it on the counter when I got home. When I arrived, I picked it up, read it in its entirety, placed it in the folder with the first version, and called Ramona from my driveway. She said, "He is trying again." That works in our favor, at every subsequent stage. I went inside and made dinner, and Marcus came home at 7, and we talked about the Douro Valley itinerary, and I told him I was looking forward to the Quintas at harvest time. I meant that too. On the Thursday morning, I met with Ruth Chambers at her offices on 5th Avenue for 90 minutes. She walked me through the financial summary she had completed, page by page, with the focused and methodical attention that had made her irreplaceable to me for 8 years. She set the annotated email on the desk between us and pointed to 3 specific sentences she had underlined and read. She said, "These are the ones that carry the most weight if this moves into litigation." I nodded. She said, "Are you all right?" I told her yes. It was a complicated kind of yes, the kind that holds steady, because it has been carefully reinforced, and not because the weight it carries is light. But it was true. I attended the final dress fitting on the Wednesday before the ceremony, and stood on the raised platform in the seamstress shop while she adjusted the hem, and I looked at myself in the 3-panel mirror, and I thought, this is what composure looks like. I attended the rehearsal dinner at Rigsby's Kitchen on the Friday evening and sat beside Marcus and touched his arm and laughed at the appropriate moments and watched his face all evening with the attention of someone reading a document in a second language, looking for the things between the lines. What Ramona did in those 8 days was this. She filed an emergency protective order on the Carrington Drive property through the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, which meant that no deed transfer affecting that property could be recorded without my explicit written consent, witnessed by a notary, confirmed free from duress. She drafted a retroactive prenuptial agreement, which under Ohio law could be executed up to the moment the marriage ceremony commenced, covering all property I owned prior to the marriage, all revenue and assets of Ashford Strategic Group, and any property acquired with funds traceable to either premarital source. She prepared a formal legal notice on her firm's letterhead that would be served on Marcus's awareness at a time of my choosing. And she prepared a second document, a clean copy of the email from Marcus's business partner correspondence, annotated in my handwriting with the date, the source, and the legal significance of each statement made, which Ramona confirmed was admissible as evidence of intent in any subsequent property proceeding. Ruth Chambers, working in parallel from the financial records and account statements I had been quietly compiling since the summer of 2022, completed a comprehensive analysis of Marcus's actual financial position. I want to share what she found with you, not because the numbers are the point, but because numbers have a way of making the picture clear in a way that words sometimes cannot. Marcus Delaney's gross income as a commercial real estate broker was, in his best year, approximately $320,000. His net worth at the time of our marriage was built almost entirely from leverage. He held 2 investment properties, both mortgaged at over 90% of their current appraised values. His personal line of credit carried a balance of $63,000. He had a car payment on the Audi. He leased his condominium. He did not own it. His retirement accounts were underfunded for his age by a significant margin, partially because of investment decisions that had not performed as projected, and partially because of spending patterns that Ruth described in her written summary, without editorial comment, as inconsistent with long-term accumulation. He had been, in short, building toward the marriage as a financial event, and the event he had been building toward was not equal partnership, it was acquisition. I read Ruth's summary in my kitchen on the Thursday evening before the wedding, while Marcus was at a dinner organized by his brother Derek, whom Marcus had chosen as his best man, and who worked in insurance and who had also, it turned out, reviewed the deed transfer document and found it reasonable. I read the summary once. I read the email once more. I read Ramona's memorandum. I closed the folder. I went to bed at 10:15, and I slept. Not perfectly, but fully, which genuinely surprised me. I think what allowed me to sleep was the absence of uncertainty. I was no longer in the position of sensing something without being able to name it. I knew exactly what I was walking into, and I had decided, with full information and full legal protection in place, that I was going to walk into it anyway. I was going to walk down that aisle. If you are still with me right now, I want you to stop for one moment and leave a comment. Have you ever had to perform normalcy while quietly building your way out of something? Have you ever smiled through a dinner, or a meeting, or a conversation, while another part of your mind was working through something that the other person in the room had no idea about? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to hear you. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now, because what happens next is the part of this story that I think you have been waiting for. The wedding was on a Saturday in the 3rd week of June. The venue was Scioto Reserve Country Club, a property with rolling grounds and a ballroom that held 230 guests without crowding, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the course on the western side and a terrace on the east that caught the morning light. I had chosen it because I loved how it looked at golden hour, and golden hour on the day of the wedding was exactly as beautiful as I had imagined it would be. My father, Harold Ashford, who was 68 years old and who had been an electrician for 35 years, and who had sat at my hospital bedside the night before my appendix was removed when I was 14, and held my hand without saying anything at all, because he understood that silence was sometimes the most generous thing you could offer someone, walked me down the aisle. He held my arm in both of his hands. As we reached the entrance to the ballroom, and the music shifted, and the doors opened, and the room turned toward us, he leaned close to my ear and said, very quietly, "You look like you know something the rest of us don't." I turned and kissed his cheek. I said, "I love you, Dad." He squeezed my arm and we walked forward together. Marcus was at the altar in a charcoal suit he had chosen with care, and he looked, I will say this with full honesty, beautiful. He looked the way I had imagined he would look when I said yes at Lindy's 18 months before. And when I reached him and took his hand and the officiant began to speak, I watched his face with the same careful attention I had been giving it for 8 days. What I saw was genuine warmth, real happiness, the satisfaction of a man who believed he was standing at the moment where everything he had worked toward was coming together. He was happy, He was also, underneath the happiness, satisfied in a way that had a direction to it. He thought he had won something. The ceremony was 32 minutes long. We said our vows. I looked at him when I said mine, and I meant them in the way you mean things that are true, even inside complicated circumstances. I do not regret the vows. They were true when I said them, and they are true in retrospect, which is a strange thing to say about a marriage that lasted 4 months, but I have learned to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. We exchanged rings. The officiant said the words that made us legally married, and the room broke into applause, and Marcus kissed me, and I let him, and I was calm in the specific way that you are calm when you have done everything you needed to do, and the next step is simply to let the plan arrive. The reception moved into the ballroom. There was a cocktail hour with a quartet, and past hors d'oeuvre, and the particular brightness of a room full of people who are genuinely happy to be together. Lauren gave a toast that made the room cry in a way that felt like relief. The good kind. Derek gave a toast that was mostly about Marcus and that made the room laugh. Marcus's college roommate Brendan gave a toast that was brief and warm and that I thought was the most honest thing anyone said that evening. I sat beside my husband at the head table, and I ate my food, and I thanked each person who stopped to speak to me, and I danced with my father, and I danced with Marcus, and I was present in my body for all of it, which is something I credit to the 8 days of preparation that had removed uncertainty from the equation. At 20 minutes before 9 in the evening, between the end of the formal toasts and the beginning of the first dance playlist, I excused myself from the head table. I had arranged for Ramona Voss to arrive at the venue at 9 o'clock and to wait in the lobby near the main entrance. She was already there when I stepped out of the ballroom, in a dark blazer, reading glasses on their chain, holding a slim white envelope. We did not exchange pleasantries. We were not that kind of professional relationship, which is one of the things I respected most about her. She handed me the envelope. I said, "Thank you, Ramona." She said, "Call me Monday." She left. I stood in the lobby for approximately 90 seconds. I looked at the envelope in my hand. I thought of the breakfast table 9 days ago, and the sticky note that said, "Just a formality." I thought of Marcus's smile when I told him I would think about it. I thought of Patricia saying, "He talks about money a lot," and me laughing it off. I thought of the burgundy notebook, and the email, and Ruth's 2-page summary, and Ramona's memorandum. And then I walked back into the ballroom. I crossed the room without stopping. Marcus was standing with Derek and Brendan and 2 colleagues from his brokerage, whose names I had learned and whose function in this moment was to be witnesses. I reached Marcus and touched his arm lightly, the casual touch of a wife at her own wedding, and he turned to me with the full warmth of a man who was in an excellent mood and had no reason to be otherwise. He said, "There she is." He put his arm around my shoulders. I looked at him. I said, "Marcus, I have something for you. A wedding gift." And I held out the envelope. He looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He smiled because we were in public, and the smile was the default. He took it and opened it with the easy confidence of a man who is accustomed to things going his way. He unfolded the pages inside. I did not watch his eyes. I watched his face, the whole of it, the way a face moves before the person controlling it has decided what to let through. The first page was Ramona's legal notice on her firm's letterhead, advising Marcus Ashford, the legal surname he now carried as of 41 minutes prior, that the property at Carrington Drive, Upper Arlington, Ohio, was held in a single-member revocable trust established in the name of Caroline Ruth Ashford, that no co-ownership interest existed or would be established by virtue of the marriage, that no deed transfer affecting the property could be recorded without my witnessed and notarized written consent obtained free of any form of duress, and that any attempt to assert co-ownership without... The second page was a copy of the email. I watched the process move through his face like weather. First, the smile held because he was still operating on social autopilot. Then, the smile became something that was trying to remain a smile, while the information behind it reorganized. His jaw set. A small vertical line appeared between his eyebrows. He read the second page more slowly than the first. Derek noticed something was happening and stepped closer. Brendan noticed and stepped back. The 2 colleagues from the brokerage took 2 measured steps to the side. The instinctive distancing of people who can identify the edge of a situation they do not want to be standing in. The room was full of music and conversation around us, and inside that noise, there was a perfect stillness at the center of our small circle. Marcus looked up from the pages. He looked at me. His face was something I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not grief, Not the cold distance of 4 days after the Dublin investment conversation. Something quieter than all of those. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that he has been entirely outmaneuvered by someone he had assessed as the easier party. He said, very low, so that only I could hear it, "What is this?" It was not a question, it was a man realizing an answer he did not want. I said, just as quietly, with exactly the same steady tone I had used 9 days earlier when I set his document beside my plate. Just a formality. I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Marcus." And I turned and walked back through the room toward my father, who was standing near the bar with my mother, and who looked up as I approached and held out his hand, and I took it, and the music kept playing, and outside the windows, the last of the evening's golden light was still on the grounds. The next 4 days were the most instructive days of my marriage, which tells you something important about how short that marriage was. We had a honeymoon booked in Portugal, 10 days in Lisbon and the Douro Valley wine country, and we went. I want to be honest about why we went. I went because there had been a version of me, until the Thursday night I closed that folder in my kitchen, that had hoped I would not need what Ramona had prepared. I went because I am not a person who punishes. I had protected what was mine. What Marcus did with the remainder of our story was going to be his choice. On the second evening in Lisbon, sitting on a terrace overlooking the Tagus River in the warm Portuguese evening with a glass of wine and the city spread out below us, Marcus said, "I wasn't trying to steal from you." I held the silence for a moment before I answered. I said, "Then what were you trying to do?" He looked out at the river. He said, "I thought it was what couples did. I thought you were being resistant for no reason." I said, "Marcus, you presented me with a deed transfer drafted from an internet template, with no attorney involved, with a sticky note telling me your brother's opinion 9 days before the wedding. At no point did you ask me what I wanted. You told me what was going to happen." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry." It was the first time in 4 years that I had heard those 2 words from him, without a qualifier attached to them. I said, "I believe you. I meant it. But sorry doesn't answer the question of who you thought I was when you put that paper on the table." He did not have an answer to that question. I do not think he had ever been asked to develop one. We came back from Portugal. We attempted for 3 months a version of marriage. I will not describe those months in detail, except to say that they were useful in the way that certainty is useful. Even when what you are certain of is something you would not have chosen to be certain of. What became clear over those months was that the deed transfer had not been an error in judgment or a cultural miscommunication or an inelegant expression of love. It had been the clearest, most transparent version of an orientation that had always been present underneath the dinners and the Tuesday flowers and the remembered names. When that orientation could no longer access what it was oriented toward, Marcus did not know what else to do with our mornings. He tried. I will say that for him honestly. He was attentive in ways that felt like effort rather than instinct, which was its own kind of revealing. He made reservations, he suggested weekend drives. He asked about my work with a focus that felt like someone studying for an examination on a subject they found difficult. He was trying to locate a version of us that did not require the access he had lost, and he could not find it, because it had never been the version that was driving him. There were evenings in those 3 months when I sat across from him at dinner and felt something close to grief. Not grief for what had been taken from me, but grief for the shape of the thing I had wanted to believe we were. I had been 40 years old when I said yes at Lindy's, and I had not said yes lightly. I had said yes because I was hopeful, and because hope is a form of courage, and because the alternative, which was to close entirely, had seemed worse than the risk. I do not regret having been hopeful. I regret that he met my hope with calculation rather than with the same thing. That is a grief that is real, even when the outcome is correct. I filed for divorce in October of that year, 14 weeks after the ceremony at Scioto Reserve. Ramona handled every element of it with the same precision and warmth she had brought to every step of the prior months. Before I signed the filing, she sat across from me in her office for 20 minutes and went through the expected timeline and the likely points of resistance, not because I asked her to, but because she knew, from years of sitting with women in this particular room, that being told what to expect is one of the most useful things you can offer someone who is about to do something irrevocable. Because the trust structure was fully documented, because the prenuptial agreement had been executed the morning of the ceremony before we left for the venue, because Ruth's financial summary was clean and complete, and because the protective order on the property had been in place for 9 days before we married, the proceedings were orderly. They were not brief, because Marcus retained his own counsel, and his counsel made several arguments that Ramona addressed in writing with a level of patience and precision that I found genuinely admirable. But they were orderly. Marcus received nothing from Ashford's strategic group and no claim to its revenues or assets. He received no interest in the Carrington Drive property. He received no interest in the Granville Street commercial building. He received the contents of the joint household account that had been open for 3 months, which held $11,420 we had pooled for shared expenses. He received his vehicle, he received his lease, he received his watches. He received the knowledge, which I believe he will carry in some form for the rest of his life, that a woman he had quietly assessed and quietly underestimated had been, from the first afternoon he handed her that document, exactly 3 steps ahead. He called me once, 2 weeks after the divorce papers were finalized, on a Tuesday morning at 9:05. I answered because I had expected the call and I had decided I would answer it. He said, "I just want to understand what happened." I sat with the phone for a moment. Then I said, "What happened is that you handed me a document and expected me to sign it because you believed that women who are in love do not look carefully at what they're signing. And I looked carefully, Marcus. I looked at everything." There was a long silence. He said, "You were already 10 steps ahead of me, weren't you?" It was barely a question. I said, "I was exactly where I told you I was the whole time. You just decided in advance what I was capable of, and then you stopped paying attention." There was nothing after that. I wished him well and meant it. Then I hung up. I want to speak directly to you now, whoever you are, wherever you are in the world watching this. If you have ever sat across a table from someone who claimed to love you and felt underneath the warmth, the quiet wrongness of being assessed rather than known, of being valued for what you have built rather than for who you are, please listen to what I am about to tell you. That feeling is not paranoia. It is not insecurity. It is not you being difficult or guarded or impossible to love. That feeling is an instrument, and it is a precise one, and it has earned the right to be taken seriously. When the love someone offers you feels, underneath its warmth, conditional on your compliance, when it bumps against your legal protections or your financial independence and goes cold, when you notice that what you have built is being cataloged rather than celebrated, you are allowed to open a notebook. You are allowed to call an attorney. You are allowed to take every step necessary to protect what you have spent your life building, while still being kind, while still being calm, while still being fully, genuinely present in your own story. What I learned from Marcus is not that men are untrustworthy, and it is not that love is a trap. What I learned is that love is only as safe as the clarity it operates inside. A love that asks you to surrender your legal protections in exchange for its continuation is not love. It is leverage. It is leverage wearing a well-cut suit and carrying a beautiful watch and knowing exactly how to fill a room with its laugh. And there is nothing shameful about recognizing leverage when it looks you in the eye from across a breakfast table. There is nothing cold about calling a lawyer the same afternoon. There is nothing calculated about protecting what you built before someone arrived who had not been there for the building. The coldness was already in the room before you named it. You are simply the one who had the clarity and the courage to say its name. I kept the house on Carrington Drive. I live there still. I have repainted the bedroom and the study in the time since the divorce, warmer colors than I had before. I have started building a greenhouse in the backyard, which I am doing slowly and without any particular deadline, because I have discovered that the building of it satisfies something in me that the completed version cannot. Ruth Chambers remains my accountant and my closest professional confidant. Ramona Voss remains on retainer. Lauren and Patricia came for dinner 6 weeks after the divorce was final, and Patricia looked at me across the table with a glass of wine in her hand, and she said, "I told you he talked about money too much." I said, "You absolutely did." And she raised her glass and I raised mine, and we laughed until the kitchen felt entirely mine again, which of course it always had been. I want to tell you something about the year that followed, because I think it matters. The year after a marriage ends badly can be one of the loneliest years a person moves through, even when the ending was the right thing, even when every document was in order and every decision was sound. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from having to rebuild not just your daily life, but your sense of what you are capable of believing about another person. I experienced that loneliness. I sat with it in the evenings, and I did not try to hurry it or explain it away. I let it be what it was, which was evidence that I had cared. And caring is not something I want to become cautious about. But I also worked. I have always worked, and work in those months was not an escape but a return to the clearest, most reliable version of myself. Ashford's strategic group had its best fiscal year on record the year the marriage ended. We crossed $3 million in revenue for the first time. I hired 2 new associates in the spring, both of them young women, who reminded me of myself at 28, precise and ambitious, and still learning which battles were worth fighting and which were worth simply outpacing. I gave Ruth Chambers a raise that she received with her characteristic composure, and then, 3 months later, confessed to me over lunch that she had gone briefly to her car and cried, which remains one of my favorite things I know about any person. Life did not become easier after the divorce. It became cleaner, and I have learned that clean is a form of beautiful I had not known before that year, that I was missing. Lauren came over on a Saturday in December, and we cooked dinner together and sat at my kitchen table until midnight, talking the way we had talked at 23, about everything and nothing in the same breath. Patricia joined us for dinner, 6 weeks after the papers were finalized, and looked at me across the table with her glass raised and said, "I told you he talked about money too much." I said, "You absolutely did." And we laughed until the kitchen felt entirely mine again, which of course it always had been. My question for you at the end of this story is this: has anyone in your life ever mistaken your silence for surrender? Has there been a moment when someone who underestimated you discovered, too late, that your stillness was not passivity but preparation? I want to read about it. I want to know when you stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided what you were, and what that silence felt like from the inside. Leave your answer in the comments below. I am there. I am reading every single word.